Hello and welcome to REST API with Spring 5 section 2. So in this section we are going to learn Spring REST, how can we create REST API using a Spring, and then we are going to consume the Spring REST API that we create in the video 1 using the REST template. So this video will explain how REST template works, and then we will see the runtime example of consuming the RESTful web services. And then in the last video, we are going to consume reactive REST API using the reactive web client like Flux and Mono, subscribing it to the publishers. In this video, we are going to talk about what is REST, and we will create our first REST endpoints. What is REST? Representational State Transfer is a simple stateless architecture, and when a web service uses this architecture, it is known as REST API. REST resource can be represented in various forms like JSON, XML based on the consumer. It is stateless and runs over HTTP. Now it has 4 verbs, mostly for the create purpose: post, read is to get, update, use put, and if you want to delete something, use delete. How do you build RESTful service using Spring? So there are two methods to do that. One is content negotiating view resolver. We already learned about it, so we are not going to discuss it further. Second is HTTP message converter. Message conversion is just a way to transform the data produced by the controller into a representation which your client can understand or client wants to consume. Alright. To do the message conversion, there are already converter resides in Spring framework. You can go to this link to cover up all the message converters. Let's discuss few of them one by one. Most of the cases you don't have to do any configuration for these message converters, but somewhere, let's say you want to convert JSON, you want to use XML, in those cases you would have to give the dependency of JSON like Jackson or XML. Alright, so we will see about that. Now the string HTTP message converter, this reads all type into a string and writes with a content type of plain text. Form HTTP message converter, it can read and write form data from the HTTP request and response. Form data is read from and written into a Spring multi-value map. A byte array HTTP message converter, this reads byte arrays, reads from all media types and write an content type of application octet stream. This can read and write XML. Mapping Jackson to HTTP message converter, this can read and write JSON using Jackson's object mapper. Mapping Jackson to XML HTTP message converter, this can read and write XML using JSON XML extension. That's why mapping JSON to XML. Now if you want to use mapping Jackson to HTML message converter, right? So in that case you would have to provide a dependency, Jackson dependency. You are good with all the message converters that you have and you don't have to configure anything. But what happens when a controller method returns a Java object instead of a logical view name? So if you have an object instead of logical view name, by default that object will end up in the model to be rendered as a view, right? In a view. Now to avoid this and implement message conversion, @response body needs to be used. The response body annotation will tell Spring to return a Java object as a resource to the client, converted into the representational form that the client can accept, right? So if based on client accept headers, the representation form will be chosen, whether it would be a JSON or XML or something else. When client wants to insert data using API call, okay, then request body @request body tells Spring to find a message converter to convert a resource representation coming from the client. So if the client is want to insert the data and he is sending JSON, so you might want to convert JSON into the object. So you can define what kind of data a REST endpoint will handle by using consume in @request mapping. So your handler, what kind of data will it consume? So you can define the consume equals to, let's say JSON, then application/JSON in @request mapping. And request body is used so that the incoming data from the client can be converted into the desired value, from JSON to XML, from JSON to object, from XML to object, right? Those things. If you have lot of methods in a controller, you would be using response body on all of them. So a shorter way to do that is to use @RESTcontroller instead of using @controller. Now if you annotate your controller class with @RESTcontroller instead of @controller, Spring applies message conversion to all handler in the controller. The last is response entity. So what is a response entity? Now so far so good, you have response body, you have request body as well, but what if you want to return a status code or a header values along with the response? So you can use response entity object, so which carries the metadata. What is the metadata? Like headers or a status code along with the response object. Now let's see how do you create the REST API using all these message converter annotations. So we have Spring REST API section 2 over the GitHub. Let's see the configuration. The root configuration that we are using is root_config.class, and in root_config.class we have a property placeholder which is reading the database properties from an application file, resources application.properties, and it has the repository config imported as well. So let's see the repository config too. Now in the application.properties you have the JDBC driver. We are using JDBC template and will be using memory database HSQLDB. Now the repository config, we have everything mapped and we are using driver manager data source, setting the driver class, URL, username and password. Alright, now it will make the connection to your in-memory database. Alright, that's good. What do we have in the views? Nothing. So we don't have any JSP pages. All we are going to do is to return JSON. Okay, so let's see the pom.xml. Now the Spring version that we are using is 5.0.0 release. We have the Jackson data bind as a dependency, HSQLDB as a dependency, and Spring JDBC as a dependency. So your model has a user, and this user has username, user ID and phone. That's what we are creating the table, users table in the in-memory database, holding these three values. In DAO, to do the CRUD operation, save, you are inserting into the users using JDBC template, using the data source that you just created, and doing the update part or save part, insert part. Find one is going to return you one user based on the user ID. Find all is going to return you all the users. Update is going to update the user based on the user ID. Delete is going to delete the user based on the user ID. And the create table method is to create the users table if it doesn't exist in HSQLDB. Okay, now and the services to call all the DAOs method. Now in the home controller, start with find one. If you are going to read, so this should be get method. You can define the consume type over here. So we are using a parameterized path variable. So path variable ID, so whatever the ID that has been passed will be treated as user ID, and that particular user will be searched into the database. So that's what it is doing. So it has the response body. If you are using REST controller, you don't have to write the response body. Okay, so you can remove this response body. Now it is going to return you the response entity. Okay, so what does the response entity hold? It holds the metadata along with the response as well. So the response would be user. Now your service is going to find the user based on the user ID. If the user is not null, then let's return HTTP status okay, else return HTTP status not found. Okay, we can use this HTTP status object in response entity object that we are returning. So we are returning the response entity user, so the user that we are returning, and along with the status is what we are returning in. Now the find all method, it doesn't have a request mapping, so by default slash, so if somebody hit slash, it would be giving the all users in the data. Now if you want to delete a user, so you have a URL, delete and then id. Instead of response entity, you can also use response status. It is going to return you response status http status okay, and it is going to delete the user based on that. Go to the update. So if you want to update a user, it is also going to return you the status okay, and it is updating the user based on the user passed. So if you want to set the username or change the username based on the user id, so the request body, now see the request body, so it has the request body user. So whatever the data client would be sending, let's say JSON or XML, it would be converted into the object user. Spring is kind enough to figure out what kind of message converter does it need to use. Okay, now let's talk about the create part. So create part is post, update part was put, and searching reading was get, like finding, and delete was delete. The mapping for create is slash create or slash. So if somebody is going to post over slash or create, it's going to insert into the database. It is returning the response of http status created, the response body and response entities also it is returning. What it else it is returning? It is returning the location of inserted user. So let's say you are going to insert a user, so that has been passed into the request body. You have created the user into the database. Now it is going to return you the URL of where you can get the details of the user, what is inserted right now. So you can use URI component builder to do that. URI components give the path, that is the ID. So what is this ID would be the user's ID. Alright, now build and expand, this ID would be converted into the users dot get user ID. Okay, so remember we have this method find one. So this find ones returns you based on the path variable ID. So you have the context path, localhost 8080, and then Spring REST API, and then you have slash ID. So that ID would represent that particular user, right? So it is going to return you with the context path slash ID. So the latest user that has been inserted into the database. Now you return it in the response entity. Response entity dot created. Now you have the URI component dot to URI and then build this response. Okay. Now so far so good. So that's how you can create your REST endpoint. Now let's hit them one by one. We are going to use the Postman as a REST client. So let's first hit the find all method to see how many users are already in the. So this would be a get request to this. So there is nothing in the database as of now. So let's insert. So to do create, you need to do post, where you are posting either slash or create, one on the same thing. You need to provide what kind of content that you are passing. Okay, insert the data as a JSON, and this is the data that you are going to insert. Okay, now let's hit send. So the return status is 201 created. That's what we were returning as a status. And now let's hit once again to see how many users do we have. So we have the user Batman with the user ID 1 and phone null in the database. Now let's insert another user 2. So 201 created. Let's see, find all Batman and Joker. Now let's find single user based on the path variable. So let's say you want to figure out a user having the user ID 2. Let's hit a send get request, and here you go with the user having the user ID 2. Alright, now let's update a user. To update, it was the method put. Now once again, content type is JSON that we are sending. In body, in raw, we are going to give the user to update. Since we are not updating the phone in the database, we don't have actually used the SQL to update the phone. So let's change the username to wetwomen on the user ID 2. So the status is okay. Now let's see what is the user on ID 2. Now it is Batwoman instead of Joker. Alright, great. Now if you want to delete a user, so we will be using delete and the path variable, that is the user ID that we want to delete. The method would be to use delete and hit send. Alright, so status is okay, and let's see what is the user, what are all the users. Now you are left with only one user, Batman, having the user ID 1. Now remember, we haven't done any data validation as in the ID exists or not.